Surrealism, one of the most exciting movements in the history of Western art, and I have to say also one of the most complex to cram into an hour of presentation. So I have decided to divide the presentation in media. So we're going to look at paintings and then move on to ready-mades, which are really important to the surrealists, photography, and then film. And that way we can navigate different ideas multiple times and go over thoughts and concepts that we have encountered. And I hope that will help us getting a picture of why surrealism is so exciting. As you will see, the presentation ends with a little bit of a homework session for you because there are two surrealist masterpieces, short films, black and white short films, one by Dali, one by Dali and Buñuel, and one by Maya Deren, that are 15 minutes long. I don't have the time to show them to you as part of this lecture, but they're available on YouTube for free, so that could be a continuation for you to explore and experience later on together or on your own. So one of the questions as I began to put together this lecture was, where do I start from? And I thought, well, I'll give you some references, some basic ideas of where can we begin to make sense of surrealism. And one good place, I think, is to think about Dada. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Dada already. It's the groundbreaking, innovative movement of the last century that began as a response to the First World War. Dada means nothing, or it means Dada, as in yes, yes, or rocking horse. And it was the most provocative and groundbreaking movement the Western world had ever seen. It originated in Zurich throughout the First World War, and it was a response to the insanity of the war. It was a response to the bourgeois and capitalistic values that artists believed had led us to the First World War and the atrocities of it. And it manifested itself in a total disrespect for classical art and any other idea or concepts we had encountered before in art. Marcel Duchamp is still today one of the most important artists in the history of art because of his revolutionary drive. He invented ready-mades. As you will see, ready-mades will come back to haunt us today. Ready-mades are mass-produced objects artists buy or encounter and sometimes cobble together, as you can see here in bicycle wheel, which is a combination of a stool and a bicycle wheel, or sometimes just alter a little bit to make unusual, to make strange, in order for us to see meaning in these objects that we normally would not see when we use them in everyday life. So the idea of the ready-made really is to remove the function from the object so that they become an object of contemplation and we can cast on them our imagination and cultural ability to see beyond form and matter. And of course, the very famous urinal fountain, which has changed the history of art, a now perhaps collaboration between Marcel Duchamp and Elsa Hildegard Baroness von Freytag-Lorengoven, who was a pioneer, a female Dada pioneer, who's been erased from the art history book and who might actually be, there's still no solution to the controversy, the real maker of the very famous urinal that shocked the Dada movement in New York in 1917. We will talk more about what the art object, as in ready-made, does to meaning later on. But I'll continue first with the influences and origins of surrealism. You couldn't have surrealism without psychoanalysis, right? And especially this man, Sigmund Freud, the founding father of psychoanalysis, who started to formulate the idea of the unconscious, the idea of an absolute lack of control. It's a very important notion that actually changed the way in which we think about ourselves. The idea that parts of our brain are independent and that continue to produce meaning and assess the experiences that we have every day in a way that it's not under our control, really freed artists to explore what classical art had not explored before. So psychoanalysis, the analysis of dreams and other ideas related to the unconscious return over and over in the context of psychoanalysis. And that's also why sexuality is such an important focus in surrealism, because as you will remember, Sigmund Freud was particularly interested in sexuality himself. He saw phallic symbols and sexual symbols a little bit everywhere he looked, and therefore the surrealists mirror that level of interest. And materiality. Now, materiality is very important to surrealism. Media and materials. They are a very groundbreaking movement following the example of Dada in pioneering new approaches to art making using different materials that are not considered art materials in the tradition of classical art, and also embracing very seriously photography and film, which were media that other movements prior had not considered quite as seriously. The most important concept in surrealism is the uncanny. What is the uncanny? Is the familiar made strange. And in this familiarity that's made strange, the surrealists find a wealth of opportunities to make us think and rethink our certainty. As you will see, tonight can be life-changing to you. There will be concepts I will explore with you that will make you rethink what it is that you're seeing, the nature of what you're seeing, and the nature of reality itself. Surrealism has been trivialized a little bit because, like Impressionism, the paintings can be eye candy, right? And art history, popular art history, has cashed in on surrealism a lot. There's money involved in Impressionism, there's money involved in surrealism, and unfortunately that has diluted the true pioneering and experimental force of surrealism that I am going to try to recover for you through this presentation. So before surrealism started in 1924, there was Dada throughout the war, and many Dada artists in 1924 transfer from Dada to surrealism because it feels like Dada has accomplished anything that it could have. And before all of that, before Dada becomes a really important and influential movement, and before the birth of surrealism, we have Giorgio de Chirico. Now, Giorgio de Chirico was a Greek-Italian artist. He spent a lot of time working in Italy, then he also worked in France. And it is claimed that the movement of which he was part, pittura metafisica, metaphysical painting, is actually the true root of surrealism. And you can see this painting dated 1913 already shows us many of the ingredients we will find in works by Dali and other artists. Funny, not funny thing, Giorgio de Chirico is invited to join surrealism after André Breton writes the manifesto of surrealism, and some claimed stole the idea of surrealism from Giorgio de Chirico. So what do we see here that it's typical of surrealist strategies? Well, first of all, this is not a real cityscape. It's imaginary. It already smells of dreams, right? You can see this big arches and darkness through them that already place on the map this idea of anxiety, unknown, and uncertainty. Then the lack of narrative that we see here and the seemingly haphazard juxtaposition of objects invites us to make sense of the painting in a symbolic way. So as we look at it, we try to think about this bust that we see on the left that looks like a classical bust used in art school to practice life drawing, and then we see this bunch of bananas right next to it. Of course, there is a wealth of interpretations here. I used to work a lot with this painting at Tate Modern in London, and I would always ask my students, what do you think the title is pointing at? The uncertainty of the poet. Who is the poet? And everyone just sort of scratched their heads and wonder, like, why I don't understand this. Well, it's about sexuality, right? This is about, or it could be one of the readings. It could be about anxiety performing in bed. So you have a bunch of bananas representing sexual drive of a masculine way, and you have the body of a woman that's been turned into plaster, right? It's a sculpture. It lacks head, arms, legs. This is not the good start for an evening of sexually fulfilled desire, right? And right in the background, you see a bricked wall with a train riding right behind it. There is no way for us to get onto this train. It's not a station. And the train is about to depart and leave the painting. You can interpret the train as a sexual symbol as related to Freudian psychoanalysis. And this impossibility to get to the train, a form of castration, a form of impossibility to accomplish this departure, this moving forward, right? Hence the uncertainty of the poet. You can understand how even the Kiriko is already laying the foundations for what Dali will explore later on. I'm not going to talk to you at length about Dali because Dali is so overexposed in the history of Surrealism, but it's impossible to deliver any lecture on Surrealism without talking about Dali. He was an incredibly accomplished artist in the technical sense. And as we know, he loved Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis. Allegedly, he read all the books back to back, and his ambition was to represent what he read in the books in his paintings. There's a funny anecdote that claims Dali went to London to visit Freud during the 1930s after Freud relocated there, and that he brought a painting for Freud to see. And unveiling the painting, he apparently told Freud, "Here, I have painted my unconscious." To which Freud answered, "It's impossible for you to paint your unconscious because it's unconscious. When you paint it, it has already become conscious." We don't know whether that really happened. It's also claimed that Freud didn't really like Dali and let him wait for an hour outside his home in North London under pouring rain. Regardless of the relationship between the two, we know that Freud was very troubled by the Surrealists because Freud had struggled himself for many years to assess psychoanalysis as a true science. And suddenly to have all these artists coming along with really exuberant looking pictures trying to convey this idea that this is what psychoanalysis looks like, or this is what psychoanalysis does, really made him fear that all his work would be demoted because of this artistic attention. And paintings such as these really show us how Dali tried to decode some of the examples that Freud discusses in his books. In this case, we have the metamorphosis of Narcissus, and the ideas that Freud used in his books harken back to classical Greek mythology a lot. So it is no surprise to find Dali grappling with Narcissus. You will remember the story, beautiful man sees his reflection in the water, falls in love with his reflection, tries to hug himself, and drowns. But however, he was made the most beautiful. He was the most beautiful man on earth, allegedly. And because he was the most beautiful man on earth, he felt that he could treat everyone else with disrespect. The hand, we see Narcissus here almost transformed into a rocky formation. And the same silhouette and shape that we see here is echoed in the hand of the gods that is made of stone because it's immortal and eternal, holding an egg, which is the symbol of rebirth. And from the egg, we see a narcissus, a daffodil that emerges from the surface. So we see this reincarnation, because it's what, as the story goes, it's what the gods did to allow Narcissus new life in the form of a flower. The rest of the painting remains mysterious, like this checkered board with a sculpture that seems to show us Narcissus posing, these figures in the background that nobody has ever really decoded or understood, and this recurring landscape, which is actually the landscape around Figueres, which is where Dali was born. If you look through the hillsides here behind the mountains at the very back, you will see another echo of the hand of the god holding an egg peering through, and this dog eating a carcass right next to it, ants crawling onto the stone. I can talk to you about ants a little bit more later on in a different painting. One thing I have to tell you is that to really understand Dali's paintings, you need to read his interviews, because it's in interviews that he actually explains some of the symbolism that we see in his works. Symbolism that comes from personal experiences, symbolism that comes from a desire to stray away from classical art and to represent what was impossible to represent before the innovations brought forward by Surrealism. So, for instance, here we see with the persistence of memory, Dali's famous melting clocks. What do they represent? They represent the status of clocks and time as quantities that are not solid and permanent. Think about time itself. A clock enables us to visualize the passing of time, and yet imagine time without clocks. It would be measured by the nature around us, and yet everyone's perspective of that time is different. To an insect, a day is a lifetime sometimes. And of course, in dreams, time also becomes a fluid quantity. So I hope you can notice the analogies between the painting by the Chirico with these platforms and a landscape that is mainly barren and desolate, and what Dali does. And here again we have ants. I might want to tell you now what ants represent in Dali. They represent mainly two things: sexual desire and death. Dali in an interview said that sexual desire is like ants. You can never stamp it out at once. You kill a few and there's always more coming back to tickle you. And one time when he was a child, he actually saw a big locust, a dead locust, being dismantled by ants and brought back into the ant nest. So for him, ants become this combination of these two experiences, one that is metaphorical and the other one that is linked to an experience he had as a child. And I hope that that makes you get a closer sense of how Dali builds his symbolism, how it becomes cryptic, how it becomes sometimes very difficult to unlock. This is one of his lesser known works, but nonetheless haunting and very dramatic. It's called Cannibalism in Autumn, and believe it or not, it's about the Spanish Civil War that took place between 1933 and 1939. It's very much based on the idea of Spain consuming Spain. And you can see these two abstract bodies merging into each other because at the same time they are one, two different factions, political factions, but at the same time eating each other, consuming each other, and destroying each other. And in the background, you can still see the landscape of the region in which Dali was born as a reminder of origin, as a reminder of a place that it could be linked to and find his own standing ground. This is a Tate Modern, and I used to work with this painting a lot with students and museum visitors when I lived in London. And this also shows us how Dali's work is very enigmatic, essentially. How paintings can have multiple meanings. Again, we're going back to the interpretation of dreams. Think about a dream you've had. If you try to interpret it, it will always elude you. And whoever else might interpret it for you might also face the same challenge. Images are made of images that dreams are made of images that can have multiple meanings. And that really interested Dali in the making of his art and his paintings. Depending on how you look at this work, you might see different things. And the funny thing is that some people will see things that others will never see. And there's just no way around it. Now, you might see here something that looks like a crater or a quarry, something convex, like a big hole. But because of the reflection, you can also imagine that this is a body of water. Maybe it's a lake. And if you look a little bit more carefully, you can see that maybe there's more than a lake here. It almost looks like a fish, right? There's a tail here, and maybe the gale here. And you can see the head of the fish here, maybe abstracted. So what is this painting about? Well, the title, Mountain Lake, tells us something that's very important from a biographical perspective. Surprise! Dali had a brother, also called Salvador, that died before this Salvador Dali was born. And his mother only revealed that the artist had a brother later on in his life. And it was very traumatic for Dali to come to terms with the fact that A, he had a brother he never met that died, and second, that the brother that died was also called Salvador. So it kind of got him thinking around who he was in the context of this secret that was being kept by the family. The mother told him that when his brother died, Dali's mother and father went to a place called Mountain Lake to grieve the loss of the child. So you suddenly can read the painting as a mournful experience, or as an opportunity for Dali to reconnect with his lost brother. See the telephone receiver here? This is exactly what it might be about. And you can see that it's held up by crutches. Dali started to paint crutches after he broke a leg and used crutches in his real life and began to feel that crutches can represent the symbol. They can work as the symbol of precarity. And on this telephone, there are two snails, one crawling on the stick of the crutch and the other one on the telephone itself. Another story that Dali related was that when he went to meet Freud in London and he was made to wait outside for a very long while, he looked at snails crawling on Freud's bicycle. And he started to fantasize about the idea that snails in the shell have a big brain and they must be extremely intelligent. We know that's not the case, but that was Dali drawing connections between the intelligence of Freud and the animals he saw around in the garden as he waited to meet the very famous psychoanalyst. And there's also a figure here that is perhaps the most enigmatic in the painting. Some of you will just see a rock, but others will see the Virgin Mary and a child. I don't know how many of you see the Virgin Mary and a child. This is the face of the Virgin Mary. Maybe this is the cloak. This is the child, or all bundled up. Or perhaps others will see a skull. You see here, like the eye socket, the nose, and the mouth. So this is a Virgin Mary with a child that also already looks like a skull. So already inscribing the death. And this would make perfect sense, because if this is a painting about losing his brother, losing a child, then motherhood, and the loss of a son very well fits the story of the Madonna and child. And Dali places a streak of red here on the shade, on the cloak of the Madonna, which reflects into the water in perhaps what might seem a representation of the female sexual organ. I leave that up to you. Now, the painting is complex enough in symbolism, and then Dali decided in an interview to change the meaning of the work and say that it was about the conversation that Hitler and Churchill were having over the phone about the future of Europe in the wake of the Second World War. So you see how he also changed the narratives he had already painted in order to give the painting that dreamlike power that it's so important to surrealism. But I wanted to talk to you about Magritte. Remember I told you earlier that surrealism has been trivialized, right? It's been simplified because people make money out of surrealism if you make it mysterious and fun. But Magritte has been trivialized perhaps more than anybody else. Magritte thought of himself as a philosopher, not an artist in a classical sense. And this work, called The Traitor of Images, is the quintessential explanation of what I mean. Magritte was concerned with perception, how we understand the world, and how language shapes the world for us. And that even when we look at images, like this image of a pipe, we're actually thinking through language in our minds. The very moment we call this brown shape with a black tip a pipe, that's it. It's a pipe in our mind, and it's more than a picture. You can see that the line in French reads, "This is not a pipe." And it seems to make perfect sense. The picture of a pipe is not a pipe. But the sentence, "This is not a pipe," is also not a pipe, right? He tries to play with our mind and tries to make us realize that even when we look at something that we think it's visual, it is never purely visual, unless it's a very abstract painting, because we always find names to give things which attach visual form to meanings, cultural references, history, religion. You look at a pipe, you think of usually a man of a certain age, an intellectual, right? A pipe is never just a pipe. It carries all these other connections with it. And Magritte really expanded his research into perception when he made a series of paintings during the 1930s that play with the notion of vision and what it means to be human and to view the world. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea that according to physics, we don't see the world directly. Eye travels through our eyeballs, and it's what we see, it's deconstructed in electrical impulses that are transmitted to the brain, where the brain recomposes what we see in our minds. So what we see with our eyes to us looks like the outside, but it's always already in our brain. There is no direct contact between your pupils and your brain. There is no direct light that goes through. And Magritte was very aware of this and tried to explain this human condition in his paintings by painting an easel with a painting, which, as you can see, completes or extends an image which the painting claims is the real sea and beach. And of course, this is all painted. So it's a painting of a painting in which a painting pretends to stretch a real landscape which is actually painted. You can see the game, right? And he did it over and over. Look at this painting here Human Condition, again, 1933. You can see how this canvas on the easel is positioned perfectly against the window so that it continues the landscape, and then it betrays the illusion right here, just on the edge of the curtain. And yet, this image is a painting in itself, a reproduction of a reproduction of a reproduction, which tells us that we as humans, we can never access true reality, either because language always comes in to make anything we see burdened with meaning and ideas that we have given to reality, or because the visual world we see around us is a fabrication of the brain. And here's my favorite painting that I used on the first slide of our presentation. If you visit the Art Institute of Chicago, you can see it there on the third floor in the modern wing. And it's absolutely beautiful, not just because we see these beautiful colors, but because it always reminds us that we give so much for granted due to our experience and the ability of our brain to retain experiences through memory. Now think about this. You're an alien and you're coming on Earth from Mars. It's mid-afternoon and you think, wow, Earth looks interesting. There's all this life going around. Imagine seeing sunset happen. This disk in the sky that you may or may not recognize as the sun begins to slowly near the horizon line. As somebody coming from a different planet who doesn't have any knowledge of a sunset because they might not experience it, would you fear that this very bright disk will crush down onto the surface of the planet and cause a massive explosion that could wipe all life away? You probably would. And instead, we know that that's not going to happen, that the sun is going to disappear behind the trees, not in front of it, and that we're all safe. And we also know that it's going to come back tomorrow. So we can enjoy the sunset as a beautiful moment of romanticism every day. But what if you didn't know how things are going to go? What if your brain didn't remember that that's how it's going to go? So this type of inquiry, which is very existentialist and very philosophical, has always been sort of diluted in art history because it's kind of unsettling. I hope I'm not unsettling you too much. But this is another beautiful work we have at the Art Institute of Chicago. We have some of the best Magrittes, by the way, right here in our city, where you can see time transfixed and this beautiful idea of something absurd happening and the impossibility of it materializing nonetheless. Magritte was an incredibly neat and accurate painter. You can see the details of the work, the neatness of the light, right? Everything is incredibly synthesized to the very essence so that it looks as if it were a dream. It's not detailed in a way where imperfections can get in the way of the meaning. Your lovers. This is where I'm going to get you to doubt your lovers. Do you really know them? Can you ever really know somebody else? Look at this kiss where both lovers are shrouded in mystery. Is anyone cheating? Is anyone lying? And even this very close contact is based on projecting on somebody else your dreams, your emotions, your passions, and hoping that they will match and fulfill your vision. We're blind, constantly blind, until we have seen enough of that person that we might actually start to notice the discrepancy between what we see, what we want to see, and what they really are. I also have to say that Magritte's mother committed suicide and that she was pulled out of a river with an handkerchief covering her face that was placed on her face by those who pulled out the body as a sign of respect. And that Magritte was aware, he was there witnessing the scene, and that scene really stood out to him. And return to haunt him in his paintings, as we see here as well. And of course, the very famous The Son of Man with the apple occluding the face of this individual that looks very distant and very absent. Again, a similar meaning to the one that we saw earlier, a similar investigation in a sense of this impossibility to access alterity, to access the reality behind somebody's face, behind somebody's intentions. Another fantastic artist that I'm sure you are familiar with is Juan Miro. Miro was the abstract artist in Surrealism. And at the very beginning of Surrealism, when Miro was making works of art that were looked at with suspicion by other surrealists and the public because they looked so different, Breton and other supporters of him in the movement at length tried to bump him up and to acknowledge that Magritte was Miro was the most surrealist of the surrealists, because he was the one who was abandoning reality and was actually crafting a new language through which to express the mystery of living. But when Miro became very famous during the 50s and 60s, then the same artists who were supporting him began to say that he was a one-trick pony who never really developed his style. See how it goes? What is so special about Miro? Many things, dare I say. Look at this painting and look at the colors. Look how different it is from what Magritte and Dali were doing. The distortion of form only becomes more and more pronounced until Miro comes to the realization that what he wants to do with these paintings is to break down the classical notion of importance. Think about classical paintings, any classical paintings involving a subject like a Madonna and child, more than saints and Jesuses, more than a historical figure. Miro realized that painting is a hierarchical form of expression in which the artist decides who is the main character and who is subordinate. And he started to envision the possibility for artworks in which everything is equally important as everything else. And he started to call them constellations. There is a series of works he made in the 40s called Constellations and 30s. Because when you look at the sky, the stars look as if they're all more or less equally important, and they look equally far away from us. So the constellations are opportunities to rethink the structure of painting and to treat everything on the canvas as equal as everything else. Miro suffered depression, and he was very existentialist in his approach to art. His shapes, his forms that you see here in the works are called biomorphic forms, which means that they allude to living organisms, but that they don't represent specific organisms. Oftentimes he uses shapes as the one that you see here, in which we can recognize the body of something like an amoeba, protozoic. Of course, when it comes to surrealism, not everyone embraced abstraction, and artists like Frida Kahlo used surrealism not so much to explore nightmares and dreams, but to investigate their own lives and the intricacies of gender constrictions as they experienced them. In this painting, Frida Kahlo poses as a very androgynous figure who is in charge. You can see that in the oversized suit she wears, which might actually allude to her husband, Diego Rivera, who she had divorced in 1939, a year prior to the making of this painting, because of adultery. And in this painting, it's so powerful because you can see that she has cut her own hair. And Diego Rivera loved her hair. However, there's also a Mexican cultural reliance on the notion that women should have beautiful, long, flowing hair. This is the song, the tune that Frida Kahlo has painted in the back and transcribed at the very top, is about a man admiring and loving a woman because of her hair. And you can see that the hair has become almost this symbol of livingness. It just floats around the image and it squirms around the image as if it were alive. And yet Frida looks very proudly at the viewer with a sense of defiance. When Frida left Diego Rivera, she said she was going to support herself through the sales of her artwork and she wasn't going to depend on him in any way. But Frida Kahlo also harnesses surrealism in these representations in which she becomes part of nature and she explores ideas, as in this case, of heritage and origin, with roots, as you can see, with these branches coming out of her and positioning her body onto the ground itself. And also by representing her pain, physical pain, as caused by the terrible tram accident that you will remember almost paralyzed her, and also emotional pain when she feels, as you can see here, hunted down like a deer, and therefore she creates a surrealist symbolism and atmosphere. You can see how the trees outline a landscape that is almost reminiscent of the Chirico early cityscapes. Remember those arches again. There is something uncanny and troubling about not being able to see what lurks behind. And as a note, I wanted to say that when André Breton, the leader of Surrealism, traveled to Mexico to see Frida Kahlo, he was adamant that Frida Kahlo had to join the Surrealist movement because he said, your works are so surrealist. But Frida Kahlo was doing what she was doing without the knowledge initially of the Surrealist movement in France. And she always said, well, I guess I am a surrealist, but not necessarily as part of the discourses of surrealism like other artists were. And also, that's also why she retains her own identity within that context. George O'Keefe, we're talking about the leading ladies of surrealism, who I love the fact that they are not influenced by Dali or the other big men of surrealism, but retain their own identity and therefore never are followers or copycats. They actually have their own aesthetics. And of course, I could have showed you lots of flowers of the kind that you know by George O'Keefe, the kind that look like sexual organs, but that she claimed are not about sexuality. Of course, Georgia, of course. But this beautiful work is in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago, and you can see how it's almost an allusion to the passing of time itself. There are yellow leaves with damages and a daisy that represents the opportunity for something new to come to life. And another beautiful work we have at the Art Institute with the cow skull with the calico roses, where the calico roses are a representation of loss and rebirth in the tradition of New Mexico indigenous cultures. And of course, the skulls that George O'Keefe collected in the New Mexico desert, which become thereafter in the early 30s the representation of America struggling through the Great Depression and the Dust Bowls. It's fascinating to see again how George O'Keefe, of course, she was very aware of surrealism. You would remember Alfred Stieglitz, her husband, being one of the most influential photographer at the time, who was engaged in the discourses of pictorialism as well as surrealism to a certain degree. So again, you can see how Georgia O'Keeffe negotiates her own brand of surrealism in a way that it says what she is interested in saying. And when it comes to Picasso, we can't really say that Picasso really ever became a surrealist artist, but many art historians acknowledge that the influence of surrealism led Picasso to reinvent his cubist language in works of art like Guernica. You will remember that Guernica was made in 1937 in response to the bombing of this small town in Spain called Guernica, a bombing, aerial bombing orchestrated by Mussolini, Hitler, and the dictator Franco, which was designed to test the destructive power of new ammunition that could be dropped on a civilian town. The challenge was to see how long would it take to obliterate everything, and therefore there was no information delivered to anybody out of the blue. The plane came, dropped bombs on civilians, and the atrocity for that reason was not photographed because it took everyone by surprise. Picasso read about the news soon after, was devastated, and proceeded to create this painting in response, a painting that visualizes the nightmare of those who lived through one of the biggest atrocities of the last World War. So this is a true nightmare in black and white, speaking the language of the newspapers that couldn't represent the images at the time in real time. And as you can see, distorting every figure through the pain that is being experienced in a way that only surrealism could allow. Now, I might want to promise you that we're lightening up a little, but I really can't. A quote from Dali. I do not understand why champagne is always chilled and why, on the other hand, telephones, which are habitually so frightfully warm and disagreeably sticky to the touch, are not also put in silver buckets with crushed ice around them. Telephone frappe, mint color telephone, aphrodisiacal telephone, lobster telephone, telephones. And here we have it. The Lobster Telephone by Dali. Remember when I told you earlier about the ready-made being so influential to surrealism, the ready-made that was invented by Dada artists like the Baroness Lorengoven and Duchamp. The idea is that the everyday object, when manipulated by an artist with a surrealist intent, becomes strange, at times threatening, and therefore it's a source of multiple and ambiguous meanings. Have you ever wondered what the lobster telephone is about? It's a pun on sexy calls, booty calls, that at the time many of you may have enjoyed making. My students are too young for this, and they don't understand how much fun it was to ring up somebody they didn't know, just dial a number, see what happens, say something silly, and then hang up. As a child who grew up in the early 80s, I still remember having fun like that some afternoons with a couple of friends when we were left unattended. Never leave your children unattended. But of course, Dali enjoyed in the 1930s a different kind of experience with the phone, that it's very internet-like, where you can pretend to be somebody else, where you can arouse desire, right, by imagining and describing an imagery that it's not real. So the lobster on the phone symbolizes this aphrodisiac quality. And sometimes objects became strange in very unappealing ways, like this work by Meret Oppenheim, the very famous cup and saucer covered in fur. What is Meret Oppenheim trying to tell us with this? Well, think about sipping tea or coffee with that saucer. Put that fur in your mouth, touching your lips and tongue. Does it disgust you? Why? Is it because you are putting some animal derivative in your mouth that it's meant to be elsewhere? Is the furriness of it sort of shaking us to the core because it reminds us of our own animality that we try to repress with rituals such as drinking tea or coffee that at this time, much more than today, were associated with bourgeoisie and high society. So you can see how these objects and the materials, mixing up the materials in a very unusual way, makes objects that otherwise are not threatening look very threatening. Like these gloves with wooden fingers, mannequin hands that suddenly are turned into animal signifiers. Look at the nails painted in red gloss varnish and the juxtaposition with the hairy surface that almost turns this feminine and delicate hands into bear paws, right? Surrealist artists really enjoyed these contradictions and made us aware of the hierarchies and stereotypes that define society. Man Ray, indestructible object. Man Ray was actually one of the most famous photographers of the time, but he also created ready-mades. He actually created one of my favorite ready-mades that I'm going to show you in a second. Indestructible object is about Lee Miller. Lee Miller was the partner of Man Ray, a beautiful and very talented photographer. I'm going to show you some of her pictures later on when we look at photography. This is a piano metronome. Lee Miller dumped Man Ray, and Man Ray was so depressed that he thought he was going to kill himself. And in the process of negotiating the loss and the upset of being dumped by Lee Miller, he made this object, a metronome. You know the insistent, obsessive sound they make, right? Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, with the eye. This is a photograph of the eye of Lee Miller staring back. So the passing of time, the loss of the lover, the memory of the lover, and the question of their essence. And another work we have at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Venus de Milo with drawers. How many times have you gone up there on the third floor, looked at the Venus de Milo, and wondered what is going on here? And that label doesn't say anything good, right? Yes, frustrating. Well, you will all remember Venus de Milo, this one, the original one, at the Louvre. The most famous classical sculpture of all times. I don't see her much today, and I don't hear much about her anymore. But when I grew up, she still was a beautiful icon of feminine sex appeal. You know, this voluptuousness, the body, the way in which she looks flawless. The loss of the arms was always peculiar. It seems to pacify her to the point that she becomes a sexual object. Now, Dali is doing something quite interesting here. Freud psychoanalyzed Leonardo through Leonardo's diaries, right? And Dali liked that idea. How can I psychoanalyze Venus de Milo? Well, of course you can't, but he's giving us drawers to open up. And the idea is that that's what the psychoanalyst does. The psychoanalyst looks inside you. Every question is a drawer pulled out and an opportunity to see inside you. And you're thinking, okay, I get the drawers. What's with the little fur balls? Now, the Surrealists were the very first to use fur in art as a serious material. And it's because they associated fur with something very French. Now, those of you who are strong in French culture will remember that they call something the small death. What is the small death according to the French? If we were standing around this work at the Art Institute of Chicago, as I used to do in person, I would enjoy seeing you all look around and wonder, what is the small death in French culture? Those of you who know. Those of you who don't know can't imagine it. But I will tell you, since we are not there in person, it's orgasm. So, what does the fur represent? Sexual desire. You will remember that to Freud, everything we do, from brushing our teeth to brushing our hair to getting ready in the morning to going to work, is driven by sexual desire. Everything we do, at the bottom of it, it's not to better ourselves, to be better people, but it's driven by sexual desire. Now, we know that Freud's theories have been revised and questioned, but at the time, Dali was following Freud kind of like blindly. And the fur is understood as the small death because it is no longer alive, right? It's dead, but it still looks fresh. It hasn't decomposed like another animal body would have. So it's a small death. Whenever you see fur in surrealist works of art, remember it's got something to do with sex. This is my favorite ready-made, surrealist ready-made. I have actually remade myself. I bought myself an iron of this kind, early 20th century iron, and attached nails to it because that's all that there is. Man Ray glued the nails to the plate to the bottom of the iron. And it's a very uncanny object that turns a domestic object like an iron, which is positive, into a weapon that it's very negative. And you can see that both objects, nails and iron, are positive objects in the sense that we do good with them. But they both have in them the possibility of being negative, the possibility of hurting us. You put them together and you can't do anything good with them anymore. So, what is this work of art about? Could it be a manifestation of the very nature of the world? That we make good things in the world. We go out of our way to make good things, but that the world might generally be a place in which goodness is hard to come by. And this putting together of two objects shows us how easy it is to make bad things come by. Joseph Cornell, a fantastic surrealist artist who pioneered boxes, as you can see here, which he devised as mini dioramas. These are like, we have a big collection of these at the Art Institute of Chicago, right next to the Magritte I showed you. And these beautiful works really are essentially dreams in which different objects he found come together and create symbolisms, different moments in oniric vision. And I promised you I was going to talk to you quickly about film and photography and how surrealist artists embrace film and photography seriously as new expressive forms. Anahak initially is a Dada artist who cuts out images from magazines in order to critique society. And you can see him here taking on gender very earlier on. She's an artist, a female pioneer of early modern art. You can see how she gives this father high heels and a baby. And you can see here another critical take on gender with the beautiful girl, the idea of time and how beauty fades, but also how women are associated with cars and machines, right, as possessions of men. But later on in her life, she's influenced by surrealism and she creates photo montages like this one, in which you can see that her language becomes more nuanced and imaginative. This beautiful work called Love shows us this sort of Venus that no longer is a classical Venus of classical beauty, in love with an other body that looks like a combination of insect and human. So again, allowing surrealist aesthetics to let her say what she could have never said through other expressions. Man Ray, the same artist who made Cadeau and The Indestructible Object, as I said, was predominantly a photographer, and he made these beautiful surrealist images in which he explores the possibility of altering reality to create meaning that would otherwise not be possible to grasp. This is perhaps one of his most iconic and well-known images. It's a collaboration with his partner Kiki de Montparnasse, and it's called Kiki as Violon d'Angre. Now, by adding the F-holes of a violin to her back, Man Ray is making a joke that only works if you know who Angre was. Ingres was one of the most famous and successful artists in France who made a fortune painting odalisques, as you can see here. Technically, in this case, white women who posed as Middle Eastern concubines wearing a turban, a very seductive and hot number in French painting during the 19th century. And Ingres also played violin as a hobby. So, violin d'Ingres, as we see it here, is basically a French joke suggesting that Ingres made a hobby of painting women and objectifying them as odalisques in the same way that he painted the violin as a hobby, in a very light-hearted way. So it's a very interesting early conceptual work of art. The Italian artist Wanda Wultz also used photography in surrealist expressions in order to exemplify the idea that we become our pets, and that the longer we spend time with our pets, the more it becomes impossible not to see them as a reflection of ourselves. This is not just a cat that she pictured here. This is Pippo, her cat, right? So that makes a big difference. She's not, I find that sometimes this picture is misread as the assumption that she's casting herself as a pussycat or a kind of like, female stereotype. She's actually investigating something so much more interesting about her relationship with her pet cat. And I promised you some Lee Miller. Lee Miller took some of the most astonishing photographs when it comes to surrealism, imbued with a reportage flair. She was always interested in documenting, and documenting in an artistic way. You can see here a piano in London that's being destroyed by the bombings of the Second World War. But she was also very enigmatic and evocative with the imagery that we see here, for instance, in which she can basically play with notions that are very Magritte. Like you can see here an aperture in this tent that almost looks like a mirror, and this fabric, this net that it's opened, allowing the landscape to come through. Again, playing with notions that remind us of Magritte, the canvas against the landscape. And a picture of Man Ray asleep, in which, as you can see, the framing and the composition turn the objects around Man Ray into perhaps the contents of his dreams. Another fantastic surrealist artist who explored photography in the context of surrealist representation is Auger, who worked a lot with reflections on shop windows. You can see how the reflection from the outside becomes the inside, and it becomes difficult to tell if everyone on this side of the image is actually a mannequin. What about this man over here? Is this a mannequin with a very distinctive facial expression? Or is it a man posing? What we see no longer is exactly reality. Brassai, of course, documented the nightlife of Paris in ways that made it even more mysterious and enigmatic, as we see here, the backstage at the Folies Bergère, or simply playing with perspective and the size of posters that created situations that are paradoxical, like we see in this case, where Marlene Dietrich has become this enormous fantasy in the mind of his man. And again, another female pioneer, Dora Maar, who painted over her photographs, intervening on the photographic image in order to create impossible scenarios. We can see Dora Maar here and also here in The Years Lie in Wait for You, in which the notion of a spider web can become symbolic of so much more. To get to the very end of our presentation with my invitation for those of you who didn't find this presentation unsettling enough to go all the way with Un Chien Andalou by Dali and Buñuel, and also Meshes of the Afternoon by Maya Deren. These are masterpieces of surrealist cinema. You can find them on YouTube. Just type up the names of the artists and the titles. You can watch them for free in your own time. I strongly recommend them. This is art student 101. Anyone studying art history and film studies with a certain level of seriousness has watched these films. I can just tell you at a glance, it takes a long time to get to the bottom of it, of the narrative, because each artist explores very complex aspects of life and very complex narrative structures. So just to help you a little bit, you can read about them online, but Un Chien Andalou, the title means nothing, so don't waste any time trying to work out what the title means. It deliberately means nothing. But it's a dreamlike scenario, nightmarish scenario of a relationship in which the male character is unfaithful. And there is this negotiation of guilt, this negotiation of desire that happens, the weight of Catholicism and classical culture. But I also want to give you a warning. This film, in the very first 5 minutes, includes one of the most shocking scenes in the history of film. And it happens, I don't want to tell you what it is, but I want you to know so that you can look down if that happens, so that you're not all traumatized. But there is a moment where there's a moon and a little cloud coming through. If you don't want to be shocked, look down until you hear the end of the music, and then you will not see it. And I can't tell you what it is. It's a surprise for those of you who will dare to watch and then tell the others what they saw. Meshes of the Afternoon is a less frantic and much more haunting short film. Again, about perhaps, I certainly read it as a film about adultery and lack of trust in your partner, and obsession, the obsession that takes hold of you when you lose sight of truth and reason and are led down a spiral of suspicion and doubt by your partner. And as you can see, it's very dark. It ends very badly. So, with all these promises of dreams, nightmares, desire, our lecture comes to an end, and I hope you enjoyed as much as you expected.